Hello, welcome back to the ABEI Webinar Series. My name is Mariana Bofarini, head of the Brazilian Association of Irish Studies, which aim at spreading Irish literature and culture throughout Brazil. To learn more about ABEI, please visit our website, www.abeibrasil.org. It is a great honor to be hosting this 10th webinar on Oscar Wilde in conversation with Eibhear Walshe, all the way from Ireland. Professor Maria Rita Drummond Viana from the Federal University of Ouro Preto will moderate the session along with Esther Borges and Manuel Carlos Alves. A certificate will be offered upon registration on the Event3 platform through the link in the description box. I would like to thank the guest speakers for accepting our invitation. The organizers, Professor Vitor Augusto Pacheco, Camila Franco Batista, Caroline Moreira Frauzino, and the ABEI Book Club, whose followers are currently reading The Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde. To all those who are watching us, our most heartfelt thanks. Don't forget to leave questions and comments in the chat. Now I will give the floor or screen to Professor Rita. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mari. Dr. Eibhear Walshe is Director of Creative Writing in the School of English at University College Cork. As a novelist, he published, always with the Somerville Press, just last year, The Last Day at Bowen's Court, 2020, The Trumpet Shall Sound, 2019, and of particular interest to us here today, The Diary of Mary Travers in 2014. He has written on Kate O'Brien and more recently on Colm Tóibín Bean, but it was his Oscar's Shadow, Wild Homosexuality and Modern Ireland that really changed the game, for me at least, as did his 2013 special edition of the Irish University Review on Queer Ireland, which he co-edited with Anne Mulhall and others. Walshe has also impacted the ways we read, study, and teach Irish authors as an editor, with his selection of Elizabeth Bowen's Irish writings, which came out with College University Press, in 2011, and more recently with a much-needed selected writings of Speranza and William Wilde with Liverpool University Press, again, just last year. It is my absolute pleasure to welcome Dr. Walshe for this, as Mari said, this grand finale, this webinar following the collective reading of Picture of Dorian Gray, so expertly organized by ABEI's own Vitor Pacheco and the students here today, Esther and Manuel. Please, Dr. Walshe, we are eager to hear from you and your all-around knowledge of the Wilde family and Oscar's legacy. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much for inviting me. It's been such a bizarre year for all of us. So being able to meet virtually is the next best thing to meeting in person. And I'm really honored that you've invited me to come and speak today. And I'm really looking forward to the questions and just to hearing what people want to know and speaking about the subject that interests me so much, Oscar Wilde, The Picture of Dorian Gray, and the Wilde family and Ireland.
Okay, thank you, Eibhear. So I'm just going to introduce the two students who are asking the questions here today. We're going to start with Esther. And Esther Gazola Borges graduated in Portuguese and English language, literature and linguistics at the Universidade Federal do Rio de Janeiro and is currently taking her master's in English Lit at the University of São Paulo, USP. Her researches are focused on queer representation and Irish literature. Esther, can we do your question first, and then we'll swap to Manuel and I'll introduce him as well.
Yes, of course. Okay, so good afternoon, Dr. Walshe. I believe my first question would be about if there are any specific traces or marks of Irishness and Irish culture in Wilde's work, and more specifically in the Picture of Dorian Gray. I ask that just because I so often hear people referring to The Picture of Dorian Gray as a very English and a very British novel. So I was wondering if there are any traces of, Irishness in it and in Wilde's work in general.
Thank you very much, Esther, for that. It's a great question. And please call me Eibhear, and delighted to meet you. And it's a great question to start on, because when I was a student studying Oscar Wilde in University College Dublin, I wasn't even aware that he was Irish. I wasn't sure that he was Irish. And I now teach the picture of Dorian Gray. I've taught it a number of times to my undergraduate students. And my argument is that to understand the picture of Dorian Gray is to recognize that on the surface, it's an English, London, 19th century society novel, but it's underpinned by what I would regard as a Gothic or Irish sensibility, derived from Wilde's own knowledge of that tradition within Irish literature, and more specifically from his parents, both his mother, Jane Wilde Speranza, and his father, William Wilde. They're collecting and then they're transcribing of Irish folktales, legends, and superstitions. Because when you think about the picture of Dorian Gray, it's a very rational, modern, contemporary novel about a man who becomes a painting, and a painting who ages like a man. And there's no rational explanation for any of this. There's no Faust figure, there's no tempter, there's no Mephisto, I should say. There's no one to tempt Dorian. We never see the transformation happening. We never see what happens at the end. So what seems to be a very modern society novel is in fact underpinned, I think, with a Gothic. Remember what Wilde said about it? Everybody, it's a very moral book, but nobody but myself will see that. And the morality of the tale is, and I know we're talking about aesthetics today, it seems to me that much of what the tale derives from is this idea that if you, as it were, make a bargain with nature, you will lose that bargain. And the reason I say this is because I've done a lot of research on the collected folktales of both his parents, and particularly his mother's rendering of those into her collections. And again, it reads to me with that sensibility. It's got the notion of the double, the notion of shadowing, public life, private vice, and revenge. But the revenge comes from inside. And don't forget, so many of Wilde's works deal with mirrors, doubles, shadowing, reflection. And I know we're going to talk a lot about pictures, and you have some great questions about that. So that's, I suppose, my first thing to say is that I've been exploring the Irishness of Oscar Wilde throughout my research and my life, really, because I'm interested to say, well, he lived in Ireland up to 1920. His parents were both very influential Irish writers. Maybe the fact that they had inhabited it so much, he decided not to write on Irish subjects. But his sensibility, I think, was formed and shaped, and he had great respect for both his parents. Thanks, Esther.
I see. Thank you very much for your answer.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you, Eibhear. Now to move on to Manuel. Manuel is a Brazilian novelist, essayist, and short story writer. He has an English degree, and as a member of the Association for Research on Irish Studies, he translated the poems of Jessica Trainor's Live is Swim. Alves has recently published his first novel, congratulations, Manuel, Gramática do Lar, and while writing his master's dissertation on the portrait of Dorian Gray, he is also working on his second novel. Thank you, Manuel.
I'm trying. Thank you. So it's great to meet you, Professor. My question is specifically about the picture of Dorian Gray, right? So the portrait of Dorian Gray has been considered through time an important example of Gothic literature, a landmark for queer studies, and even a work of resistance, right, for social and political movements regarding gender and sexuality. So, however, in a letter addressed to the Daily Chronicle, Wilde said that his novel was an essay on decorative arts. So I would like to know, what do you think about such a statement? And how do you believe that in this case, right, in the portrait of Dorian Gray, the physical or material environment affects the narrative?
I think it's a great question and lovely to meet you. Congratulations on your own novel. It's lovely to be able to work between the two. I do that myself, and we're very lucky to be both literary critics and creative writers, and they feed together very well, I think. So congratulations. And I think it's a great question. Yes, it is a novel about the decorative arts. The novel is filled with objects, but they're always the objects of empire. So we see in Dorian's house, so the things that he collects, what he regarded, or what Wilde was sort of presenting as partly the spoils of empire, but there were also art forms from other cultures outside Europe. And although the picture of Dorian Gray as a novel is a London novel, it's a novel of empire, of all that world, think of the many references to, say, the jewels of South America, the musical instruments of Japan. Often, as I say, the spoils of empire, but all of them denote a kind of counter aesthetic, something other than the mainstream European culture. And a part of that culture, of course, is its heteronormativity, its patriarchy, its gender and race sort of assumptions. But look at the ways in which Wilde fills the novel with these objects, these decorative things. And at the center, of course, is the painting itself and the idea of the representation of the painting. But the painting is of a beautiful or handsome young man. And everybody in the novel falls in love with the painting, even Dorian Gray himself. Now, of course, it's narcissistic, but what's disruptive, of course, is that this is people are falling in love with a forbidden beauty. The female object, the subject of painting, the heteronormative gaze, had always been considered, as it were, the appropriate one in patriarchal terms, that men should paint and women should be the object of the gaze, of desire, of surveillance. But what if it's a man that they're all looking at, even the man himself? And I think Wilde is right. It is about the decorative arts, and he was very interested in them. But look at what he does in terms of subverting and upsetting and undermining and shaking the foundations of a kind of European patriarchal world. So I think, yes, the physical or material environment does affect the narrative, but it helps make the narrative the dangerous novel that it is. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you, Eibhear.
Thank you.
I'd completely forgotten about the mention to the South American jewels. I'll look that up again.
Yes.
I'm always looking for mentions of South America in things.
Yeah.
We're going back to Esther now for her next question.
Yes. So since we're talking about queer representation and etc., I'd like to ask, how did Wilde's work and his persona and his eventual trio affect queer representation and the treatment of queer people in Ireland through the 20th and the 21st century?
Okay, it's a very good question. It's one of the things I pursue in my book, Oscar's Shadow. There is no doubt that sort of queer representation, queer identity was a criminalized identity in Ireland as much as in England and elsewhere. Not in France as much. And of course, that's why Wilde ends up in France. So there's something very ambivalent at work in Irish sort of cultural discourse. Wilde is a disruptive figure, was it in the novel Morris by E.M. Forster that somebody refers to someone as an unspeakable of the Oscar Wilde sort. So this becomes the name for a queer man or a queer woman. You become an unspeakable. And this is profoundly disturbing, for example, for his children, the ways in which his name becomes demonized and criminalized. But in Ireland, something peculiar and interesting happened. Because he was an Irishman in an English courtroom, because his mother was Speranza, the poet of the famine and a rebel, there was a wish to see Oscar Wilde not as a criminal figure, but in fact as a wronged Irishman standing up to the British Empire. But unfortunately, in my opinion, and for my researchers, that didn't translate into a greater empathy or sort of awareness of the potential for queer difference. Quite the opposite. I mean, homosexuality was decriminalised in Ireland only in 1993, whereas in England it was with Wolfenden in 66, 67. So there was quite a gap between the legal changes. So paradoxically, there's a sort of claiming of Wilde as a distant figure, an eliding of his queerness, but no consequent sort of saying, well, Oscar was a great rebel and a great hero and a martyr for sexuality. We therefore feel more enlightened and happier and more connected to sort of Irish queer identities. They didn't. It was as much a criminalized and a marginalized world for Irish queer women and men as it was in England or elsewhere. Thanks, Ed.
I see. Thank you. And that, yes, yeah, okay. Thank you so much.
No, if you have any more on that, please ask me. Yeah.
No, I was wondering because, I mean, of course, there was this this distance of the matter of the queerness and then it was legalized in '93, and I wonder if there was any social if queer social movements in Ireland nowadays still use Wilde as a reference or something like that.
Absolutely, he would be very much an empowering and empowered figure, and was a kind of covert figure even in days of repression. You know, a famous actor who was himself gay had a great series, a one-man show called The Importance of Being Oscar. And many men and women of that generation told me that this was their way almost to meet, that it was a kind of a focus point. So he did operate as a kind of a figure in some ways. And then since decriminalization, even before that, we reclaimed him as Irish and as queer. And yeah, he's very much part of that, as you'd expect, part of that that tradition, amongst another number of figures in the Irish past and the Irish present. So yeah, he would be a very important part of that of our identity.
I see. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I hope that was an excellent question, Esther.
Mm-hmm.
Makes me think also of the various outlaw narratives that pre-existed in the 18th century and so on. So that there has been an appreciation of the outlaw that predates all of that, regardless of what the crime is. So I can see that happening in Oscar Shadows too. Yeah. Manuel, back to you.
Okay, so my second question, right? By the time the picture of Dorian Gray was published, photography had been around for decades, becoming more and more fashionable over the years, and as the public resorted to more modern means of representation. So why do you think Professor Wilde himself, a quiet photographed person, decided to put the central element of the novel as a painting, as a photograph? And how do you think these changes, or perhaps would change the narrative?
Very good question, because Wilde understood the power of photographs. And as you said, he was very much, Wilde very much understood how you represent yourself in terms of images. So we have many brilliantly stylized pictures of him. Wilde performed the idea of himself. He was a character, he was a public figure. And I think he learned that from his mother, Speranza, who we had a fantastic event last Friday in Dublin, where finally and wonderfully a plaque was unveiled by the Lord Mayor of Dublin to Speranza on the house that she lived in. It's the anniversary of her birth, and a young woman, a poet, read a poem to her, and a young Irish woman sang a song in Irish, and the mayor celebrated Speranza's work. So Speranza is a crucial figure to Wilde in terms of an understanding that you perform your public self. You know, you are a reality TV star, as well as being, of course, a very serious writer. And therefore, why did he not pick pictures? And I think it's a very good point. Because I think Wilde understood and was very interested in the tradition of visual representation. I think his story, The Birthday of the Infanta, because of the fact that it's, I think, the Velázquez painting, and it's a way of writing about that painting. And then he has his short story, The Picture of Mr. W.H. So painting, and particularly, I think, the painting of a young man, to come back to my earlier point, the homoeroticism of a painting of a beautiful young man is irresistible to Wilde as a disruptive force. The fact that it's a picture, that it's a portrait, that it becomes a living thing that becomes loathsome, that, to go back to the folk tale image, that it becomes the physical embodiment of Dorian's rotten inner self, private vice, and then the public virtue is his beautiful face that never changes. The fact that a picture can become grotesque, and don't forget, Dorian is 20 or 21 when it's painted. He's only about 40 when it's, towards the end of the novel where all the bad things start happening. And on the picture itself has become, hideous. Now, what do you do between 20 and 40 that you become utterly hideous? It isn't just aging, and aging isn't a huge amount. It's to do with the fact that he becomes, and I think it's a metaphor, of course, for illness, disease, sexual, a hidden sexual life. Say for late Victorian, there would be an awareness, and many novels dealt with, widespread disease, sexual disease, and as a kind of a hidden signifier, demonization, for example, of tuberculosis, consumption, as something sort of decadent, and much of Susan Sontag picks this up and extends it, say, into the time of AIDS, and the ways in which discourses around illness often became implicated with unfair blame. I mean, I wonder, are we seeing this at the moment, perhaps to some degree, in the current pandemic? So the notion that a picture could embody an inner life, I think, was irresistible to Wilde, because he wanted to take on that entire tradition of the representation of self. So I think, I mean, I never thought about this before. Why wasn't it a picture? Wilde was so interested in photography. It's because I think he wanted to do something with the tradition. He wanted to unsettle that tradition as well. Thanks, Mama.
Absolutely. And as a new art, I think maybe the representational aspect of photography wasn't as clear to people who were seeing it, because how much Basil puts himself into the painting is also a very important point. I've put all of myself into the painting, whereas with the picture, now we know, of course, there's framing and everything else, but maybe they weren't aware how much the taking of photographs was also something that revealed the artist as much. Fantastic.
And now it does, as you say. Now we know.
Yeah, now we know. True. We've gotten used to the medium, I'd say, and realized its potential a bit more. All right, Esther, it's back to you.
Great.
Okay, hi. So I believe for my final question, I would like to ask about if you would say that Wilde's style of writing and perhaps his source of inspiration as well were affected by his time in prison, because I always hear about how his writing was never the same after he left prison, and I was wondering the characteristics of how different they were, and etc.
I think it's a very sad question, very true. I mean, he left prison. He had in prison written the remarkable De Profundis, as we know. He had one wonderful piece of work left, which was the Ballad of Reading Gaol, and some letters that he wrote to the newspapers on basically the kind of awfulness of prison life. And that was it. He made his way to Paris, and then eventually, to everyone's horror, reunited himself with Lord Alfred Douglas. And then they split, and then he came back to live and to die in Paris. And during that time, he was selling plots to new plays to about 5 or 6 different people at a time, but he never wrote any, and he couldn't. And it broke his, and he wasn't that old. I mean, he was in middle age, but it was gone. His writing had ended, really. And I think to be able to survive prison as he did, 2 full years of hard labor. They said most men of his class who were not used to physical work would have died, but he survived. I think the question of just surviving, I think, exhausted and ruined his work. But the Ballad of Reading Gaol is a wonderful final moment. But, you know, the kind of, when you look at his life and his collected work, all the poetry, the novel, the short stories, the essays, the plays, every genre, you know, stories for children, he excels in every single genre. And then afterwards, he's not writing at all. And I find it heartbreaking because I know myself as a writer, I could never imagine myself not writing. And he grew up in a house of writers, but he stopped. And I think his health was broken, and his concentration was broken as well. So it's a great question, because I think it's a very sad ending.
Yes, it's really it's an awful thing what happened to him, and it's also, I think it's just extremely sad for the world and society and the world of literature in general that we lost such an amazing writer even before his death.
Yes, and I think I agree. I think he just couldn't. I think it was left. You know, I think he had nothing. He was broken as a writer, and his health was broken too.
Yes. Thank you very much for your answer.
Thank you.
Manuel?
A last question, right? In his Oscar Wilde, Richard Ellman argues that the two schools of thought that most influenced Wilde were those of John Ruskin and Walter Pater. Ellman writes that though both Ruskin and Pater welcomed beauty, for Ruskin it had to be allied with good. For Pater, it might have just a touch of evil. And that while Ruskin spoke of fate, appeal to conscience, Pater spoke of mysticism, imagination, seen as wantonness, what Ruskin saw as a vice, right? So I want to know, is there any other philosophical or literary aspect that you believe can add to one's reading of The Picture of Dorian Gray?
Yes, I mean, I think, you know, there's the kind of, between the two, you know, you have the notion of beauty that has to be allied to good, and then beauty that is its own good. And of course, Wilde, I think, was attacking the kind of bourgeois notion that art had to have a utilitarian purpose. I mean, he said really scandalous things like, you know, a book has neither to be good nor bad, it just has to be beautiful. We have no problem with that, I think. If one of you gives me a book to read, you say, I think you should read this book, it's really morally good, it's, you know, it's going to really uplift you, I think, okay. But if you give me a book and say, oh, it's beautifully written, it's just such a wonderful, you know, I thought, oh great, I'd love to read it. So we don't seem to have that judgment on literature, that kind of, you know, the debate that literature has. Does it have to have a moral purpose as well as an aesthetic purpose? I mean, I think so much literature has, you know, in the past 100 years or so, has changed and has altered. You know, we might read something, even if we're told this will make you feel really despairing of all moral hope. Well, let's try it. Let's read it. Let's see what it does, you know, to our imagination. So, I mean, I think Wilde was attempting to break what he saw as the kind of moral imperative from late Victorian art, and to kind of, but I think part of that was part of him just being not just being, but being radical. What other ways can we read him that kind of empowers us? Well, I think obviously a queer reading is something that I've always interested, because it seems to me in The Picture of Dorian Gray, Wilde is always skirting on the surface. It's like he almost says it and then he comes back. You're thinking, oh my gosh, you know, what are all these things that has happened to these young men that Dorian has, you know, driven to, and then we discover, oh well, one of them does this thing and one of them does that thing, one of them does the other thing. They're all explained away, gambling or marrying the wrong wife. But the thing we really think is, oh, has he seduced them? So he's always sort of on the edge of a potential queer disruptive reading, and then comes back because of the censorship of the time. And so obviously now we can read beneath the surface, but his own contemporaries had a pretty good idea as well. You know, James Joyce said, you know, that anyone who has kind of observed the life of men or lived in life knows exactly what Dorian Gray's secret is, and that he who has committed it sees it. So in a sense, Joyce saw the book as a kind of mirror that says, whatever the hidden secrets of patriarchy are, you project them into the kind of blank space of Dorian's sin and secret life. So yes, I suppose that's one way. I mean, we've been talking about this already, but one way of thinking about Wilde is as someone who allows us to read him in a queer way, and he knew that, and he was inviting that, and he was writing for his own friends and for people who would understand that.
Absolutely. The whole queer coding has always been something that we needed to interpret and keep covert, but to know each other. Absolutely.
Yes, I think so. That's it.
Esther, I'd love to have one more question from you. I said only 3, but we have time for another question from you.
Yes, of course, of course. Okay, so there has been this overall movement, I believe, in this rise in social trends and pop culture in general as well, about works that are related to the appreciation of aesthetics and beauty in art and in life, and valuing that above anything else. I was wondering if you would see that as a direct echo of Wilde's work and his influence in society.
You think, I mean, is it really about the kind of his contemporary relevance or his sense? I know you've sent me the question that Wilde would influence our contemporary interest in the aesthetic. You wonder if he's sort of part of what we see, that he is an influential figure in terms of kind of popular interest in the aesthetic.
Yes, that would be my question.
I think he is. I mean, I think one of the interesting things about Wilde, I mean, I'm delighted, and I'd like to, both of you might tell me a bit more, and indeed all of you. I mean, the notion, why? I mean, I'm reading Wilde since I was 18, which is not yesterday, and both of you are kind of engaging with his work. Is it true to say that Wilde continues to engage a contemporary generation?
Yeah. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. Yes, totally.
Yeah. And when you think about it, his language, his subjects, you know, the world of the picture of Dorian Gray, you know, English high society and duchesses and the language of the time. And I mean, this is something I had to come up against when I was writing my novel, The Diary of Mary Travers. I live in the 21st century, but I had to imagine conversations in the 19th century, in the middle 19th century. And what I didn't want is to have them speak like some sort of, stilted cliches. So I suppose I had to think about, well, what way did people speak to each other in that time? And I had to find a language for myself that was correct for the time, but was like people speaking to each other as we were speaking in a more formal way here. But if we weren't, we were just having a short conversation about something, you know. I mean, we're kind of debating something more formal, so our language is perhaps more formal or perhaps more measured. But, you know, so it's to find that language, and Wilde's language has continued to engage. And I'm just love the way, for example, so many young people seem to reconnect with Wilde's life, his story, his poetry, the wonderful kind of, you know, the Happy Prince, the Selfish Giant, the Birthday of the Infanta, and Dorian Gray itself. And I've taught it year after year to my first years. And we have a variety of ages, but mainly people coming straight to university. And I never have to sort of sell the concept of living in a Victorian world. Because I suppose, well, we're all readers, we all love to read. But it seems to me that there's this sort of, and one of you asked it in a question, it's kind of a blend of his writings and his life and his fate. In Paris, when you go to his grave, of course, there's so many people there. You know, it's a place of worship. You can go to the hotel where he died, now a very beautiful hotel, a really nice staff, because we went there New Year's Eve 2 years ago, and they were lovely, and we had a drink there, and they were very welcoming, and they like happy for people to be there. When he lived there, of course, the poor man, it was a very poor hotel. They were very kind to him, but the wallpaper killed him. And so it's the sense in which each generation responds to Wilde. And I think it's a combination of the queer sensibility, the sense, the belief in the interest in beauty and art and the aesthetics, but also that kind of subversive sense, and also the kind of destructive nature of the artistic world. And this, of course, appeals to all of us, great artists who die early and tragically. And there is that quality to Wilde himself, you know. So I think I'm really sort of heartened by the way in which Wilde is continuing into the 21st century to enrapture each new generation. And can I recommend his mother's writings? Because the most wonderful thing to me was to go to an event in the house where they lived, and lots of young Irish poets and writers and singers were there, and they were reading her poetry from their phones because it wasn't in print at the time, and they were connecting to her, and they found something of her voice. So it's a quality they both had, the ability to appeal to each new generation. They were both rebels, I think, and everybody likes a rebel.
That is definitely true. I completely agree. Okay, thank you so much. That was so interesting.
And thanks to you, we now have a selected writings that came out, and another one coming out this year as well. There's a new one, right? Also coming, of Speranza?
Yes, I'm working on a short biography, but it's been delayed. And then I'm also putting together, hopefully, a dedicated with another fantastic writer, Eleanor Fitzsimon. We're hoping to do a good edition of her poetry. And so, yes, we're continuing to keep. And as I say, it's been delayed, but I'm working on a very short biography, just as part of a series. So yes, it's always to keep the connection with her work. And we also had a commemorative stamp this year for International Women's Day of Speranza. I should have brought it with me, but I don't have it.
I missed that.
Yes, so the Irish postal system printed on International Women's Day a commemorative stamp to honour Speranza in the 200th anniversary of the year of her birth.
Right. Well, I'll have to look that up. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Well, for my own question now.
Great.
So in my own research, first at the Universidade Federal de Santa Catarina, and now in my new institutional home at the Universidade de Ouro Preto, I focused on life writing in Irish studies and beyond, as well as the uses of life writing in fiction and theatre. So I was particularly struck by your choice of the diary in the telling of Mary Travers's memories of her libel case against Jane and William Wilde in 1864, and Oscar Wilde's as it unfolds in her own present time of 1895. And by that, I think you found a perfect way to frame the Wilde family's brushes with the law, the periodical press, celebrity culture, the institutions of learning, and of course, the morals of their time. The older Mary is an astonishingly astute observer. And if you don't mind, I'd like to read from the April 1895 entry she writes when she first starts hearing about the new libel case involving the Wildes. Is that okay?
Please. I'd love to hear somebody else speaking the words.
Well, I love this, so I'm going to read it. I must be honest, if only to myself, in the safety of my room, and in writing these pages. It's the newspaper reports. The doctor's son is in trouble. It seems he brought a libel action in London against a marquis, but the precise details are unclear. I can tell him now that if he wins, he will lose, but he wouldn't listen. I would tell him that his heart's blood will be used up in a vain attempt to gain the perfect rose, the rose of justice, and a favorable judgment. Justice doesn't exist, I will tell him, but his ear would be stopped up, filled with his own self-justification. That's the end of that quote. There is just so much to unpack here, and for me, that is what the joy of the novel you wrote, and why I'm really enjoying it. The hindsight, the reference to I have a dog that wants to move. Sorry.
No, that's
It was on my lap.
oh,
Got a bit restless, got a bit
that's
warm.
fine. It's been a long day for him.
Yeah. Dante. So what I like about that is, you have the hindsight, you have the reference to the story in The Nightingale and the Rose, except this time the useless rose is not the rose of love, but a rose of justice. And of course, the foreshadowing of Wilde's own super-rated ear, a sad irony given his father's specialty, of which, of course, we hear more about in the novel. So my question to you is, how soon into the process of writing this novel did the idea of making it a diary fiction occur to you? And also, given Mr. Travis's own relationship with the archive, how did you approach the recording of what really happened?
Thank you for that, and thanks for the reading. It's lovely to hear it. And was it difficult to get the novel?
No, it's brilliant. It's on Amazon Kindle.
Oh, brilliant.
So
Oh, yeah.
here in Brazil, we use a lot of Kindle books, as much as I
Right.
do like printed books, just because you don't pay shipping for it and you don't have to wait forever.
Oh, that's great. I'm delighted that it's available. That's brilliant, and lovely that you got it there. Yeah, I mean, I discovered the Mary Travers case when researching Wilde in Ireland, because it's so crucial to his parents' story, and it's a true story. Jane Wilde was sued for libel, and a young woman who had been her friend sued her. So I thought, how can I tell this? Will I tell a biography? Will I write it as a literary study? And I just finished my own memoir. I wrote a short coming out memoir as about my own teenage years. And I thought, okay, let's try creative writing. And for any of you who are interested in writing novels, and Manuel, you've already done this and you're in the middle of it. When you want, if you decide to write a novel, you just have to say, if I make a mess of this, who cares? Just try it. Just try writing. Because you know what? If it's all wrong, who'll know and who cares? And that's liberating, because you kind of go, okay, I'm just going to do it. So I started doing it, and I thought, we don't know her story. There's so many facts we don't know. She was very important for a little while, and then she disappeared. And I did a lot of research, and I discovered lots of things about her. And then I thought, I can't write a history, a biography, a literary book about her, because there's so many gaps. But a novel doesn't care. A novel isn't true. A novel isn't honest. A novel isn't, a novel is a novel. It's made up, Somebody emailed me to say that I had them living in a house and they weren't living there at that period because this person had looked up the records of that time. And I wrote back and said, look, thanks for taking the time, and I really appreciate it, but I needed to change it because it's a novel, and but I appreciate you taking the time to look it up. So when I started writing, I thought, well, how can I tell her story? And I said, I can tell it from her own point of view. What if she was still alive when Oscar Wilde was in prison? She was. Where was she? She was actually living in Cork, not very far from where I live, a town outside the city. And what if she went to London? What if she met Jane Wilde, who was still alive? We don't know these things, so I just made them up. And I used them to tell her story of the earlier trial and the later story. And what I also tried to show is Mary Travers was not a very nice person in what she did. But what she did was out of anger and resentment and hurt. Nobody gets up, well, maybe some people do, but in my opinion, as a novelist, no character in my novel gets up in the morning and says, I'm going to do a really bad thing today. They get up and they say, I'm really angry about what's happened to me. They need to listen to me. And then they do a crazy thing or a bad thing. So it was to see some of the things that she did, and they were pretty crazy. I can't divulge them, but obviously they're all in the novel, available on Kindle. But how can you tell the story of someone whose public behavior for a brief period of time was absolutely sort of dangerous, I suppose, and demented and misguided? And I suppose you have to try and see where she got to. And what I also decided was that William and Jane Wilde were not, in this case, villains. Jane Wilde had a very difficult task. I decided that Mary Travers and William Wilde had been lovers. It's pretty clear to me that they were. And more than that, Jane Wilde knew that and facilitated it. And that's a hard thing to say about a marriage, but I think it's true. And I wanted to tell that story without presenting any of the three as bad, villainous, or evil. All three of them were doing what they thought they could do within the worlds they were working in. And I had immense sympathy for Mary Travers by the end, but I needed to tell her story. But actually, I also realized that I needed to tell Speranza's story, because you can be famous, but you can be famous for the wrong reasons and be remembered for the wrong reasons. So that's really, I suppose, my interest, and I suppose it had grown from my interest. One of the things I wanted to make sure, of course, that Oscar didn't really appear, that Mary knew him as a child and that was it. But the only thing that interests her is he's going through what she went through, and he's heading, as you, and thank you so much for that, Rita, what you read out there, she can see that he's going to go exactly where she went. You go to court, everybody loses.
Absolutely. And I see that you do a lot of these debunking of myths and received stories that we know about William Wilde being dirty and smelly and Speranza being late and not really getting up until 2 p.m. And you say, well, actually, she was up, but she was in the room writing. She told people to tell that she was sleeping and to be perceived as lazy when she might have been, we don't know, she might have been just working and needed the space and needed the room for her own. So I really enjoy the way you debunked some of these received myths that we have. That's really, really nice. Thank you for that. And we have a question from Mariana that I was hoping.
Thank you.
That I was hoping she would ask the question, the casement connection. And yes, there it is. It's up on the screen. So this is about the possible connections between Wilde's and Casement's trials. And despite the fact that Wilde was condemned for gross indecency in the later trial, and Casement for high treason, the imaginary surrounding surrounding the Black Diaries remained strong in terms of what is remembered about Casement, damaging his reputation, which in a sense happened to Wilde as well. So she just wants to hear your thoughts about the Wilde and Casement connection there.
I think that the sense is that, and there's been a lot of very good literature on this, I think the sense is that there's a kind of silence by Casement about Wilde. And this is the same for other figures in Irish writing, that although they would have been around, and I mean, James Joyce was very interested in the Wilde trials and wrote a lot and wrote great, very interesting. Shaw knew him, and Yeats knew him and was very good to Wilde and took care, tried to take care of him and support him. With Casement, there seems to be a silence, that he didn't get involved, that he didn't comment. But I think the parallels are very strong. And the earlier question, I think it might have been Esther was talking about, did Wilde's reputation sort of change things in Ireland? Well, no, because look at what happened with Casement, that as soon as the kind of notion of his deviant sexuality was unleashed, an enormous argument begins. Oh, the Black Diaries, they couldn't be true. It was a slur, a forgery, or if it is true, we condemn him completely. And of course, he was decisive in having his final execution. So direct evidence of homosexuality is a disaster for a public figure. And that's, I suppose, and that happened for Wilde, certainly in England. He becomes this name. And for Casement's reputation, it is a disaster. So let's not pretend that Irish cultural sort of discourse was any more enlightened than elsewhere, because the Casement, this very interesting parallel that you're talking about, it just shows us that no, it wasn't, that they were equally, at the end, it was the means by which Casement's fate was sealed.
Absolutely. Mm-hmm. And what you've said about Yeats as well, because I did a piece a while back in trying to see how reviewers responded to Yeats's portrayal of Wilde in 4 Years and in The Trembling of the Veil as well. And they all the reviewers I would say, I can't remember the numbers anymore, but so many of the contemporary reviewers did talk about Yeats talking about Wilde, and they responded to Yeats talking about Wilde. So that coming out in defense of Wilde was also carried its own risks. I think that maybe I'm not defending Casement here, but I just think that Casement might have been reticent on having the spotlight shine on him because of that as well. Okay. All right,
Definitely.
fantastic. Manuel has also written here for us in the chat about Henry James and E.M. Forster being silent. Would you like to comment on that, Manuel?
Let me have a quick look down here. Yeah. Yes, that's true. And I mean, both Henry James and E.M. Forster have had wonderful novels written about them, which I'm sure you know of. Say the wonderful novel The Master by Colm Tobin, and then E.M. Forster has been the subject of the great book by the man who's just won the Booker Prize, Damon Galgut, where they really deal with. It's interesting that both novels and Colm Tobin's new novel, The Magician, about Thomas Mann, fiction seems to be the way in which you can write about silent or silenced characters, and in their cases, a sort of an absent or silent kind of queer history. And the more we know about Forster, for example, the more we see that in fact he had, 3 very significant partners in his life, all of whom were married. And in most cases, I think he becomes part of their family life, but also has his own separate relationship. So the ways in which somebody like Forster negotiated the constraints of his time are fascinating to me. And that's why I suppose fiction is one of the ways that I see that you can write lost histories. My second novel, which is also based in Dublin, The Trumpet Shall Sound, is about the composer Handel and the first performance of Messiah in Dublin. But in fact, he, like George Frederick Handel, like Henry James and E.M. Forster, there's complete silence about his private life. Handel lived very famously, was a well-known musician, composer, entrepreneur. He ran all these great operas in London. He was a very handsome man, much loved by many men and women in his life, many good friends. Absolutely no private life. Nothing. Absolutely, as if the man, and nobody ever, I read biographies, nobody ever says, well, did he have a partner, or did he have children? Did anything happen in his life? And once the King of England asked Handel, why have you no mistress, Mr. Handel? And he said, music is my mistress, sire. I thought, okay, that needs investigating. So in my novel, The Trumpet Shall Sound, I give him a life, which is a gay life, which is my imagination, but I'm not sure it's as valid a possibility as ever. Why would a popular, likable, famous, rich, highly socialized, busy man have no partner? Well, maybe because he, like E.M. Forster and James, he lived in a time when you couldn't. So that's my version of his life. Whether it's true or not, I don't really, we'll never know. And part of me feels, well, fiction is the place in which you can do that.
Yes.
Great.
Fiction and the theatre, because I do know you also, in Oscar's Shadow, you also talk about Kilroy and the fictionalizing of Constance Wilde and Lord Alfred Douglas on stage. But we do have a question, Vito.
Yes.
You want to bring it up on the screen?
Great.
This is from Tulio from UFOP. Fantastic. Thank you, Tulio. So, wondering about Salome.
Good question. I've never seen it. I've never seen The Irishness, and I teach Salome, and I'm very interested in it as a play. But it seems to me I can't. I mean, there are probably other minds that other ways of reading it. I mean, yes, it's about sacrifice. It's about it's a play about presenting a very destructive notion of creativity. The dance as this kind of destructive force that brings with it, it's also about, Salome is about homoerotic desire, like Salome's own desire for the body of Yochanan, which is, a way in which the male body is eroticized and then demonized, because of course she talks about the beauty of his body, and your hair is so beautiful, or your lips or whatever, and then, oh, they're not, they're rotting, so it's about something that becomes eroticized, aestheticized, and then becomes what's the next phase? It becomes sort of destroyed, and it becomes the fetishizing turns into a kind of death-like mortality. So it's hard to know. It's a good question. I don't have an answer to that. I've often thought about, where does sort of the Irishness of Salome work? But it seems to me that Salome is much more a play about the homoerotic than perhaps it is about the Irish. I'm not sure. I mean, I think it's a really, I don't know whether whoever asked the question has any ideas themselves, or any of you have any ideas. I've never seen a way to read Salome in relation to Irishness.
Any last thoughts from Esther or Manuel? Any last things you'd like to ask?
No, I believe I'm good. I asked all my questions. Thank you so much for all the wonderful answers.
Thank you.
Much food for thought.
Thank you. It was wonderful.
Okay. Well, Maddie's back. Let's hear from Maddie. Maddie, you're still muted.
Oh my goodness, we've been hearing this so often, haven't we? But yes, so thank you all for such a rich and enlightening webinar. Eibhear, Rita, Esther, and Manuel on Oscar Wilde. There are so many interesting and contemporary issues surrounding his legacy. And unfortunately, Eibhear, we cannot be sharing this talk with a caipirinha here in the Brazilian almost summer, but hopefully in the near future. And to the audience, thank you so much for your questions and comments. And please keep track of ABEI events on our social media. So we hope you have enjoyed, and see you next time.
And thank you so much for inviting me. It was a wonderful experience.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mario. Thank you, Eibhear. It's been fantastic. And thank you, both of you, and Vito, who's not on screen, for making this happen. And keep reading the books.